You have been taught to think of sexuality as a physical act, a brief collision of bodies, an appetite to be satisfied. But that is not what it truly is. In essence, intimacy is the meeting of two unconscious worlds. It is the merging of psychic currents that run far deeper than the flesh, yet most remain on the surface, confusing friction with closeness and sensation with union. Today, the world speaks of eros without soul. Desire is sold in images, emptied of mystery and meaning. The sacred language has been forgotten, the language that once spoke in symbols of fire, serpent, and dove, binding love to transformation. What was meant to awaken the soul now leaves many divided, lonely, and lost. When intimacy is lived consciously, approached not as hunger, but as dialogue between two psyches, something extraordinary occurs. The act ceases to be possession and becomes revelation. When a man meets a woman in true union, he does not only meet her body, he meets her depths. He steps into the field of her unconscious, where the archetype of the feminine lives, mother, lover, maiden, and wise woman at once. If he meets her unconsciously, she feels unseen. If he comes with reverence, something sleeping awakens an ancient remembrance of unity. In that moment, she does not only receive a partner, she receives the living symbol of consciousness. And he, if awake, does not merely take pleasure, he finds himself dissolving into the mystery that gave him life. He becomes both giver and given, and the boundary of ego softens. This is why conscious intimacy becomes a path of individuation. It reveals hidden parts of each, his tenderness, her power, his vulnerability, her fire. It is a mirror where both can see their shadows. Every kiss carries traces of unhealed wounds. Every embrace echoes their myths. If they dare remain conscious, eros becomes alchemy. When the act is stripped of meaning, reduced to conquest, performance, or distraction, it no longer unites. It splits body from soul, heart from instinct, and the feminine from the masculine. The woman feels empty, not because she gave too much, but because she was not truly seen. The man feels restless, not for lack of passion, but for loss of his inner God. To rediscover depth in love is not a moral task, it is a psychological necessity. It restores psychic energy, reawakens imagination, heals the split between instinct and spirit, and grants peace by aligning body and soul. Every encounter becomes a meeting of symbols, not a consumption of bodies. Listen carefully. When two lovers unite in consciousness, each also enters themselves. Eros is an ancient mystery guiding us back to wholeness. Until we recover its depth, we will mistake contact for communion, pleasure for love, excitement for connection. When a man encounters a woman not merely as a body but as a psychic presence, a profound disturbance begins in him. Something invisible, ancient, and unnamed awakens. He feels the ground beneath the intellect tremble, for the experience touches the most mysterious layer of his being, that place where consciousness meets the living soul. At first, he is unaware of what has begun. He may believe himself simply moved by beauty or desire, yet the emotion carries a peculiar gravity, a depth that no mere attraction can explain. He senses that he is standing before something numinous, something that stirs both reverence and fear. This is the earliest sign that the encounter has crossed from the physiological to the symbolic. Psychologically, the woman's presence constellates in him the image of the anima, that autonomous figure of the unconscious, which represents the feminine soul within the masculine psyche. He feels her not as a concept, but as a living force. It is as though the unconscious had risen to meet him in visible form, clothed in the countenance of a woman. The sensation is paradoxical, both recognition and revelation. He experiences the strange familiarity of having met her before, though not in time. What stirs in him is the remembrance of something primordial, the eternal feminine that has guided men through the centuries. Eve, Isis, Sophia, the mirror of the inner life. In this moment, his physical attraction transforms into psychic curiosity. Desire is displaced by wonder. The body becomes the threshold to a greater mystery. He feels as though he were standing before a temple whose doors have been opened, and within flickers the flame of his own forgotten divinity. The more consciously he approaches her, the more he senses that she is not only herself but also a symbol. Her eyes reflect something beyond her individuality, the vastness of the unconscious. She becomes a vessel through which the invisible world looks back at him. He feels observed by the depths, measured by something larger than reason or intention. In this field of energy, the ordinary boundaries of ego begin to waver. The man who has lived in mastery, governing thought, controlling emotion, commanding his world, feels an unexpected humility. The feminine presence dissolves his categories. His intellect, so accustomed to classification, now stands speechless before mystery. He cannot name what he feels. It is not merely love, nor fear, nor lust, but a convergence of all these currents into one profound experience of being seen. For the first time, he perceives himself mirrored not by another ego, but by the living psyche. At the level of symbol, this moment corresponds to the coniunctio, the sacred union of opposites known to the alchemists. Spirit touches matter. Consciousness is impregnated by the unconscious. The man experiences this union not as doctrine, but as sensation and inward widening, as though space itself had entered him. He begins to feel rather than to think. The analytic faculties quieten, replaced by intuition, mood, and image. In her presence, he does not interpret, he listens. The woman becomes the voice of his own soul, speaking in symbols he cannot yet decipher. Many men resist this stage, for it threatens their established identity. They fear that in losing control, they might lose themselves entirely. But if he allows the process to continue, he discovers that the dissolution of control is not annihilation but initiation. What falls away is the persona, that mask of adequacy worn to navigate the outer world. When he feels her soul, he senses that she does not want the mask, but the man behind it. Her silent gaze calls forth the buried figure of his authentic self. Psychologically, this moment marks the beginning of integration. The conscious and unconscious begin their slow dialogue. Inside him, there arises a quiet trembling. It is not nervousness, but resonance, the psyche recognizing its counterpart. The feminine element within him stirs in answer to the living feminine before him. A psychic circuit closes, completing a pattern older than humanity itself. Symbolically, this experience repeats the ancient hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of heaven and earth, of the solar and lunar principles. The man feels as though he carries both in his chest, the burning sun of consciousness and the cool moonlight of the unconscious. Their interplay produces in him a strange inner light, half joy, half pain. The sensation is often overwhelming. He may feel drawn to her with a force he cannot explain, as though fate itself had arranged the meeting. In truth, it is not she alone who exerts this pull, but the archetype she embodies. She has become the vessel through which his soul demands its own completion. What he experiences is a psychic summons, the call to wholeness. In her, he perceives what is missing in himself, the warmth of feeling, the intuitive knowing, the mystery of being that his rational world has suppressed. Her presence calls these buried qualities into being, much as spring awakens the seed long hidden in the soil. He may resist, for the process is unsettling. The masculine ego does not easily yield to the irrational, yet something deeper than will begins to move him. He feels himself drawn inward, as though a door had opened in his own depths. The encounter becomes not an adventure outward, but a descent within. At this point, the man's sensations often fluctuate between exaltation and fear. One moment he feels illuminated, the next exposed. The unconscious, like the sea, reflects both light and abyss. When he looks into her eyes, he feels the immensity of both. He senses that she carries knowledge of him, that he does not possess knowledge not of facts, but of essence. It is as if she perceives his hidden myth, the story his soul has been trying to tell through every failure and longing. The discovery humbles him. He realizes that he has never truly been seen before. The psychological experience of being seen at this depth is transformative. It undermines the masculine illusion of separateness. The man begins to perceive that intimacy is not possession, but reflection. What he calls her is, in truth, a fragment of his own unconscious, brought to life through her being. In this realization, desire becomes reverence. He feels protective, not of her ego, but of the mystery she carries. He approaches her with the same cautious awe with which one approaches a sacred text, afraid to profane what he does not yet understand. If he remains conscious, this reverence matures into love of a higher order, a love not dependent on gratification but on recognition of soul. He begins to understand that what he seeks in her is not completion through another person, but reconciliation with the lost halves of his own nature. The emotional tone of this stage is profound quiet. He feels as though time slows. The outer world recedes. The conversation, the gestures, even the air seem charged with significance. Each word becomes symbol, each silence an invitation. The body is no longer the fast end of desire, but its language. Inwardly, he experiences a tension between the earthly and the divine. His instincts draw him toward union. His spirit trembles before the holiness of the act. This tension is itself the crucible of transformation. Within it, the human and the archetypal meet, creating the possibility of psychic renewal. The man who endures this tension without fleeing begins to change. He becomes more permeable, more feeling, less certain. The rigid lines of his personality soften. Imagination and emotion enter where once only thought reigned. The encounter becomes a slow education of the heart. He learns that the feminine is not weakness but depth, not passivity but power in repose. To touch it is to confront mystery, and to confront mystery is to confront one's own soul. He feels the faint stirring of something like devotion, not to the woman alone, but to life itself, now revealed as sacred. At this depth, the experience of intimacy ceases to be personal. The man senses that he has entered a realm where private desire dissolves into archetypal drama. He becomes participant in the timeless play of opposites, masculine and feminine, sun and moon, consciousness and unconscious. His sensations change. He feels both expanded and emptied, as though his interior had grown vast enough to contain the world. He may weep without reason, laugh without motive, feel awe without object. The psyche, touched by the archetype, responds with the language of emotion rather than logic. Many describe this as a feeling of homecoming, as though a long exile had ended. In truth, it is the reunion of conscious man with the feminine root of his being. The soul has always been there, waiting. The woman merely revealed it by embodying its image. From the standpoint of analytical psychology, this marks the first conscious recognition of the anima. The man begins to relate not only to the outer woman, but to the inner figure she represents. This dual awareness is the birth of psychological consciousness. Symbolically, it is the dawn of the alchemical process. The raw elements, body and soul, instinct and meaning, have met in the vessel. The heat of feeling has begun to work upon them, melting the hard separation between flesh and spirit. He feels the beginning of transformation, though he could not yet name it. Something softens in his chest. His eyes perceive more deeply. His gestures grow slower, more attentive. A subtle reverence enters his being, as though he were carrying a flame that must not be extinguished. This is how a man feels when he encounters a woman, not as object but as soul. It is not conquest but conversion. His inner world, long dormant beneath rational control, begins to breathe again. The meeting is not an event between two bodies, but a dialogue between two unconscious worlds seeking reunion. And thus, through love, or rather, through the shock of recognizing another as mirror of his own depth, the man begins his descent toward wholeness. He has crossed the threshold from instinct to symbol, from appetite to meaning. What began as attraction has become initiation. He will not yet understand that the path he has entered leads to dissolution of all certainty, to the death of the persona and the birth of the self. But something within him already knows. The trembling he feels is the soul announcing that the work has begun. When intimacy moves from the surface to the soul, the man begins to feel a subtle yet profound disorientation. What once made him strong, his reason, his composure, his control, now begins to slip from his grasp. He senses an inner loosening, as though his carefully assembled structure of self is melting under the quiet radiance of her presence. It is not destruction he feels, but dissolution, the soft breaking apart of what was rigid. Psychologically, this is the moment when the masculine ego realizes its limits. All his life, he has been trained to master, to direct, to define, to dominate the unknown. But the soul of a woman cannot be mastered. It mirrors the unconscious itself, fluid, unpredictable, alive. Before such depth, his tools fail. Logic falters, certainty fades. He can only feel. At first, this loss of mastery is terrifying. He experiences it as weakness, as though he were being diminished. He struggles to recover his habitual distance, to regain the safety of the intellect. Yet the more he resists, the more he feels himself drawn inward, pulled by a power that does not obey him. Something greater has entered the field, the living unconscious, demanding his participation. Symbolically, this is the descent into the nigredo, the alchemical night of the soul. The sun of consciousness is eclipsed. The light that once illuminated everything now seems to betray him. exposing shadows he never wished to see. The persona, the mask he shows to the world, begins to crack, and through the fissures seeps a darkness full of meaning. Inside, he feels both terror and relief. Terror at the loss of control, relief that the performance is over. For beneath his competence and strength lay exhaustion, the weariness of pretending to be complete. Her presence, unjudging and alive, allows him to fall apart without shame. He does not yet call it love, he calls it confusion. But confusion is the beginning of truth. He starts to notice strange sensations in his body, trembling, heat, a pressure in the chest. These are not merely physical responses, but signs of psychic energy awakening. The boundaries between inner and outer begin to blur. Her gaze seems to reach inside him, stirring regions long frozen by habit. The muscles of the soul, unused to vulnerability, ache as they expand. The man who once defined his worth through control now finds value in surrender. He learns that strength is not domination, but receptivity, the courage to feel. He listens, not to answer, but to hear. Her silence speaks to him, as no words can. It feels as though he is listening to the world itself breathe through her. As the ego loosens, forgotten images rise from the depths. Dreams become vivid, full of water and fire, of roads winding toward unseen destinations. These are not random fictions of sleep, but communications from the unconscious, reflecting his inner transformation. The woman has awakened his symbolic life, and the psyche responds by speaking in its own ancient tongue. He begins to notice coincidences, synchronicities that weave their pattern around her presence. Small gestures, phrases, or symbols seem charged with significance. The world itself participates in their union, mirroring the process within. Such experiences shake his rationality but fill him with wonder, for he senses that life has meaning beyond intention. In this state, the man feels the slow death of the persona. The mask of mastery falls away, revealing the vulnerable being beneath. He feels naked, almost childlike, but there is liberation in this exposure. The tight garments of identity no longer fit. He breathes differently, more deeply, as if for the first time. This internal undoing is what alchemy called solve et coagula, dissolve and rejoin. What dissolves is the false self. What will rejoin is the authentic man. But between these two states lies chaos. He feels suspended between what was and what will be, unable to define himself. Yet this very suspension is sacred, for it is the threshold of rebirth. The feminine presence acts here as a catalyst, not through will but by nature. Her being invites his disintegration, not to destroy him but to return him to the roots of his own life. The energy of eros breaks the hard crust of his personality, releasing the waters of emotion that have long been dammed. He feels as if an inner river has begun to flow again, carrying with it memories, longings, and forgotten tenderness. Many men mistake this phase for weakness or emotional collapse. They do not realize that they are being initiated into feeling. To feel deeply is not regression, it is evolution. The heart must learn what the intellect cannot grasp, that love is a mystery of surrender. The moment he allows this truth, a new kind of strength arises, quiet, unforced, genuine. He may weep, perhaps for the first time in years. The tears surprise him. They are not sorrow, but release. Each drop carries a piece of the hardness that once encased his soul. Through this softening, he begins to perceive the world differently. Colors seem deeper, sounds more resonant. Life, once analyzed, now reveals itself as something to be felt. The woman's presence becomes an interior teacher. Without words, she instructs him in humility. He learns that intimacy cannot be achieved through effort, only through openness. The psyche demands this openness as the price of transformation. If he remains closed, he will return to the barren safety of control. If he opens, he steps into the unknown, where love becomes the agent of his rebirth. Within this opening, paradox rules. He feels simultaneously powerful and powerless. The masculine energy, stripped of pride, becomes pure presence. He realizes that to love is not to conquer, but to participate in mystery. The very act of letting go becomes an act of devotion. Symbolically, this stage mirrors the myth of the hero's descent into the underworld. Like Orpheus seeking his beloved, he ventures into darkness guided only by faith. Each fear he faces, fear of loss, fear of exposure, fear of inadequacy, becomes a gate to deeper consciousness. He learns that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move through it. Psychologically, the process dismantles his dualistic thinking. He begins to sense that opposites are not enemies but partners. Control and surrender, strength and softness, reason and emotion, these are no longer contradictions, but polarities seeking reconciliation. The feminine teaches him that wholeness requires both. The sensations that accompany this realization are intense. He may feel waves of warmth rising from the lower body, or sudden stillness in the heart. Such experiences are not mystical fantasies, but the psyche's way of expressing transformation through the body. The boundary between physical and spiritual becomes porous. He is being reshaped from within. At this juncture, his former world loses its hold. The ambitions and ideals that once defined him feel strangely hollow. What matters now is not achievement, but authenticity. He begins to sense that love itself is the measure of being. This recognition does not make him sentimental, it makes him real. Inwardly, he feels a new kind of gravity. He cannot float on the surface of life as before. The feminine draws him downward into himself, into depth, into truth. This descent is not regression but return, a return to the origins of his soul, to the living source that underlies all action. The transformation is quiet yet irreversible. He is no longer the same man. Something inside him has broken open, and from that fracture, light seeps in. The woman's presence, by dissolving his control, has introduced him to the mystery of the self, the center of the psyche that transcends both masculine and feminine. When he reaches this awareness, he no longer fears his vulnerability. He sees that his need to control was a defense against the very life that now flows through him. To yield is to live, to feel is to know. He discovers that what he once called surrender is in truth the beginning of wisdom, and thus the man who entered love as conqueror becomes pilgrim. His journey no longer leads outward, but inward, to the unknown country of the soul. The collapse of control has revealed a deeper order, one not governed by will, but by grace. The feminine, once external, now lives within him as the silent guide of transformation. When a man enters true closeness, something in him begins to tremble, not out of fear, but because he senses that the threshold between his conscious life and his unconscious depths has been crossed. The moment is not confined to the senses. It is psychic, symbolic, and total. He feels that what he touches outwardly has awakened something inwardly that he can no longer keep hidden. At first he believes he is discovering her gentleness, her mystery, her fire. But beneath this discovery lies a more ancient one. He is rediscovering the buried continent of his own soul. The experience of her depth mirrors the forgotten territories within himself. Through her, the inner ocean he once dammed begins to rise, flooding him with memory, emotion, and longing he thought long dead. Psychologically, this is the confrontation with the shadow, that inner double composed of all that the ego has denied or rejected. Her nearness stirs this material from its slumber, for love calls to everything in a man that has been unlived. In her tenderness, he feels the ache of his own unexpressed gentleness. In her tears, he encounters his own grief. In her strength, the courage he once disowned. Symbolically, the woman's depth is the mare nostrum, the sea of the collective unconscious. In her presence, he senses the currents of something vast and timeless, as though all lovers before them had left their traces there. He feels himself part of an eternal rhythm of union and separation, death and rebirth, longing and release. The personal becomes archetypal. The small story of two bodies dissolves into the great myth of creation and return. This recognition overwhelms him. He may feel both expansion and fear. Expansion because the experience opens him to infinity. Fear because he senses his ego cannot contain it. The masculine mind, accustomed to measure and boundary, feels itself dissolving. He fears annihilation, yet is drawn irresistibly toward the source. This paradox is the essence of eros, to die into what one loves, to lose oneself in order to be more wholly found. In this state, the man feels time collapse, the boundaries between past and present blur. Memories of childhood tenderness, long suppressed emotions, and ancient longings drift upward like figures from the deep. The touch of her hand awakens a chain of associations that reach back to the first experience of love, the gaze of the mother, the warmth of protection, the terror of dependence. All these buried archetypes stir beneath the surface, seeking reconciliation. He realizes, often without words, that what he seeks in her is not possession but restoration. Her depth becomes a living symbol of the completeness he lost when he separated from the maternal world, when he first learned to stand apart and call it strength. To touch her is to touch the memory of union itself, not merely physical but existential. Psychologically, such an encounter marks the beginning of integration. The shadow, once feared, reveals its human face. He feels compassion for his own weakness, tenderness for his own vulnerability. These feelings are not humiliations, but healings. Through her acceptance, he learns to accept himself. The sensations accompanying this inner movement are complex. He may feel heat along the spine, tears rising without cause, an ache in the chest that is both pain and relief. These are the body's reflections of psychic transformation. The soul, long divided, is attempting to reunite with itself. Symbolically, this is the coniunctio oppositorum, the sacred union of opposites. The man's consciousness, represented by the sun, descends into the waters of the feminine moon. From their meeting arises the first glimmer of the self, that inner totality which unites light and darkness, spirit and matter. The experience is ecstatic, but its ecstasy is not the intoxication of pleasure. It is the recognition of wholeness. At this depth, ordinary language fails him. He no longer speaks in thoughts, but in images. His dreams become rich with symbols of union, the merging of rivers, the opening of doors, the appearance of birds or serpents, of fire joining water. The unconscious begins to narrate his transformation in its own sacred script. Inside, he feels a new stillness. The fever of pursuit gives way to reverence. He senses that he has entered a living temple, and the woman is both its guardian and its mystery. To touch her now is to touch the threshold between human love and divine creation. He begins to sense that eros is not a private hunger, but a universal energy striving toward consciousness through him. This recognition brings both humility and awe. He understands that he is not the master of love, but its instrument. The forces moving through him are older than civilization, older than thought itself. He feels himself become transparent, a vessel for something vast and impersonal. His identity thins, and behind it glows the mystery of being itself. Yet this very transparency frightens him. The ego, sensing its own dissolution, clings to remnants of control. He may withdraw, joke, rationalize, or retreat into silence. These defenses mark the psyche's struggle between the call of transformation and the instinct for self-preservation. The experience of love thus becomes a crucible where his whole being is tested. If he endures the fire, he discovers that the burning does not destroy but purifies. The illusions that kept him safe, his pride, his independence, his separateness, turn to ash, revealing beneath them a quieter, more truthful man. What survives the burning is not weakness but essence. He emerges less armored, more human. Psychologically, this stage may manifest as an overwhelming tenderness. He feels an almost sacred compassion toward the woman, toward himself, toward existence. The heart opens, not in sentimentality but in truth. He senses the interconnectedness of all living things, as if through her body he has touched the body of the world. Symbolically, this is the stage the alchemists called coniunctio perfecta, the perfect union, not of two persons but of psyche and soul. The man realizes that what he has been seeking in the outer feminine is the reconciliation of the masculine and feminine within himself. Her presence has served as mirror and midwife to this inner marriage. The sensations are indescribable yet unmistakable. There is a quiet luminosity in the chest, a sense of transparency in perception. He looks at her and no longer sees only a woman, but life itself in feminine form. Every gesture, every breath, every silence becomes revelation. The ordinary is transfigured into symbol. This awakening often brings tears. The tears are not of sadness but of recognition, the soul weeping at its own remembrance. He realizes that love, in its deepest form, is a movement of the divine within the human. What he touches through her is not merely affection or passion, but the pulse of eternity expressing itself through flesh. And yet, even in this expansion, he remains human. The shadow does not vanish, it becomes integrated. He feels both light and darkness coexisting in him. His desire still burns, but it is now illuminated by consciousness. Passion becomes prayer, longing becomes reverence. He learns that eros, rightly understood, is not sin but sacrament. Inwardly, he feels a transformation of rhythm. Life slows, deepens, the world appears filled with subtle meaning. Ordinary encounters shimmer with significance. He senses that the divine is not elsewhere but within all things, waiting to be perceived. The woman has become the symbol through which this truth was revealed, but the truth itself now resides in him. When he reaches this understanding, a deep peace arises. The turmoil of desire settles into devotion. He no longer seeks to take from her, nor even to be affirmed by her, but to live in harmony with what she has awakened. Love becomes not an event, but a state of consciousness. The man who touches a woman's depth and remains awake to what he finds will never be the same. He has entered the interior marriage, the reconciliation of his own divided nature. Her presence, once external, now lives within him as the eternal feminine that guides him toward the self. Such is the secret transformation that occurs when the masculine meets the feminine in consciousness. The act becomes symbol, the union becomes revelation. He has not merely loved a woman, he has encountered his own soul through her, and in doing so, he has stepped into the timeless process of becoming whole. There comes a moment in every true encounter between man and woman when his defenses, long held as proof of his strength, collapse. The walls that once kept him separate, the ideals that once protected his pride, yield before the quiet power of acceptance. The woman's presence no longer asks anything of him, she simply is. And in the stillness of that being, he feels himself disarmed. The sensation is unlike the trembling of passion or the confusion of desire. It is gentler, deeper, and unwinding. He feels his body soften, his breath deepen. For the first time, he is not performing. His gestures are no longer instruments of charm or control. They are spontaneous, uncalculated, real. The man who once measured his worth through command discovers that to be seen without disguise is its own form of grace. Psychologically, this moment marks the regression to the child archetype, not a return to immaturity, but to innocence. In surrendering his defenses, he rediscovers the simplicity of the heart that trusts. The woman's gaze, steady and unthreatening, reawakens in him the memory of being received without condition. The world that once demanded proof now offers rest. This experience is rare in the modern man, whose identity is often bound to achievement and control. Yet the psyche yearns for precisely this undoing. It seeks the point where strength yields to tenderness, where consciousness bows before the mystery, the feeling. The collapse of his defenses is not weakness, it is initiation into wholeness. Symbolically, the alchemists called this stage the ablutio, the washing away of impurities. What dissolves here is not the soul's worth, but the crust of falseness that has accumulated around it. His hardness melts into humility. He feels small, but this smallness is sacred, for it restores proportion between man and the cosmos. He no longer imagines himself master of the world. He senses himself as part of it. Inwardly, the sensations are profound. He feels a lightness, as though some invisible burden has been set down. The mind, once crowded with strategy and judgment, becomes silent. A warmth spreads through his chest, not born of excitement but of peace. The feminine presence acts upon him like water upon stone, wearing away the sharp edges, leaving only smoothness and depth. Psychologically, what is occurring is the softening of the animus attitude, the rigid masculine orientation toward dominance and analysis. In its place arises a new mode of being, receptive, contemplative, open to meaning rather than control. He begins to perceive the world not as a mechanism to manipulate, but as a living mystery to participate in. This change in perception alters everything. The woman before him is no longer an object of his projections. He no longer sees her through the lens of expectation or fear. She becomes transparent to her own essence, a symbol of the living feminine within nature and within himself. In her presence, he begins to understand that to love is to allow, not to possess. Such realization moves through him as gratitude. Gratitude not only for her, but for existence itself. He senses that love is not something created between two people. It is a field that already exists, into which they are allowed to enter. This discovery humbles him. He bows inwardly before the mystery that has chosen to reveal itself through another human being. The man who reaches this point feels both small and infinite. Small because he realizes the limitations of his ego, infinite because he senses the boundless nature of the soul that breathes through both of them. His humility does not diminish him, it connects him. In relinquishing his separateness, he joins the living current of the world. Symbolically, This moment corresponds to the ancient images of baptism, immersion in the waters of renewal. The water is feminine, representing the unconscious. To enter it is to be reborn. As he surrenders, the structures of his old identity dissolve. When he rises, it is not as a new man in the worldly sense, but as a truer man in the psychological sense. He carries less pride, but more being. At this depth, the man begins to experience what I have called the numinous, that quality of experience which is both awe-inspiring and transforming. The woman's presence becomes an epiphany. Through her, he glimpses the divine in the human, the eternal in the transient. Her acceptance reveals the possibility that existence itself may be benevolent. Inwardly, he may feel as though he has been seen by something greater than her, a gaze that looks through her eyes into the very center of his being. The defenses that once kept him from such seeing were not merely psychological. They were spiritual walls built to protect him from the immensity of life. Now those walls crumble. He stands bare before the universe, and instead of judgment, he finds compassion. The experience is often accompanied by emotion he cannot name. Tears may rise, not from pain, but from the recognition of beauty. He feels the world is living, ensouled. Even silence becomes a form of communion. To be held, or simply to be near her, is to rest within the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Birth, death, renewal, all contained in a single breath. Psychologically, this marks the beginning of integration of the anima on a higher level. She is no longer projected outward as savior or destroyer, but recognized inwardly as the mediatrix of meaning. The woman's presence has awakened his inner feminine, and through her he learns to relate to his own soul. What he once sought in another, he now begins to find within. This realization fills him with reverence. He sees that the sacred is not separate from the human. The gesture of her hand, the tone of her voice, the curve of her breath, these become sacraments, outward expressions of inner divinity. The world, once fragmented into matter and spirit, begins to heal in his perception. Symbolically, this is the moment of hieros gamos, within the psyche, the sacred marriage of opposites. The masculine and feminine, consciousness and unconscious, ego and self, unite in the interior space of the heart. The man experiences this as peace that does not depend on circumstance. He feels anchored in something eternal. He no longer strives to impress or to win. The impulse to perform has vanished, replaced by presence. He listens not only to words but to silences, not only to meaning but to being. The woman, too, feels this change. She senses that he has come home to himself. In that mutual recognition, love becomes effortless, no longer an act but a state. Inwardly, he feels as though he is kneeling not before the woman, but before life itself. This posture is not subservience but reverence. The masculine ego, once rigid in its posture of command, has discovered the sacred art of bowing. And in that bow, he finds a strength greater than power, the strength to surrender. Through this surrender, the man enters what mystics have called unio sympathetica, the sympathetic union with all that exists. The boundary between self and world dissolves in empathy. He feels the pulse of creation in his own heart. His smallness becomes the doorway to vastness. This inner transformation is not a conclusion but a beginning. Having been stripped of defenses, he is now capable of authentic relationship not only with the woman but with existence itself. The self, long hidden beneath the armor of pride, begins to emerge as the quiet center of his being. He no longer lives for control. He lives for communion. Thus, the collapse of his defenses marks the birth of a new consciousness. The man who once feared weakness now understands that vulnerability is the vessel of strength. What he feels inside, the tenderness, the awe, the smallness, is nothing less than the awakening of the soul to its own sacred nature. When a man surrenders to true intimacy, he unknowingly opens a gate to his entire psychic inheritance. The woman before him is no longer a single person. She becomes the living symbol of every feminine figure he has ever known: mother, lover, sister, goddess, earth. Through her, the deepest layers of his unconscious awaken, and with them arise the unhealed residues of his past. Psychologically, this is the activation of the mother imago and the anima archetype. The energies of childhood love, dependence, awe, fear return in full force. Her touch recalls the mother's hands. Her tone recalls lullabies and admonitions long forgotten. The psyche cannot distinguish between temporal figures when the archetype is stirred. He feels not only for her, but for every woman his soul has ever known. The sensations are profound. Her energy fills the space like warmth, and within that warmth something ancient stirs in him, the memory of being held by life itself. For an instant, he feels restored to the primordial harmony that existed before separation, before thought, before identity. Yet this same feeling can also summon terror, for to return to that state is to risk losing the individuality he has so painstakingly built. He experiences the paradox of the archetypal feminine. She is both nurturing and devouring. In her presence, he feels the mother who gives life and the mother who consumes it. The one who comforts also dissolves. Symbolically, this corresponds to the dual image of the great mother Demeter and Kali, Mary and Lilith, the womb that creates and the grave that reclaims. The man may feel waves of contradictory emotion. At moments he is overwhelmed by tenderness, at others by guilt or fear. He cannot explain it. He only knows that the woman's nearness stirs something infinite and uncontrollable. These fluctuations are not signs of confusion, but of the psyche's attempt to reconcile opposites, to unite love and dread, desire and reverence, life and death. Within, he begins to perceive that his relationship to the woman mirrors his relationship to the divine. The feminine becomes the mediator between his human consciousness and the hidden totality of the self. Her energy feels sacred, not in sentiment but in fact. She embodies the unknown. Through her, he feels the pulse of creation itself, the same mystery that moves the stars and stirs the sea. Symbolically, this is the reappearance of Sophia, divine wisdom within the masculine soul. She is not merely a figure of comfort, but of revelation. In her, he perceives the archetype of meaning, that luminous principle which unites matter and spirit. To meet her gaze is to confront the face of God as feminine, the Creator as compassionate and terrible in equal measure. Such experiences are not abstract. They are felt with the full force of the body. His skin tingles, his breath deepens, his heart beats as if echoing some ancient rhythm. These are not symptoms of excitement, but expressions of numinous energy, the psyche's recognition that it stands before the sacred. The alchemists called this encounter the coniunctio magna, the great conjunction in which the human and the divine meet within the vessel of the heart. He feels as though he has been drawn into an immense current. His individuality, once so solid, now seems porous. The world moves through him. The air, the light, the woman's voice, all are woven into one great harmony. In this state, the distinction between self and other fades. Love becomes a participation in the life of the cosmos itself. But this ecstasy has its shadow. The same energy that exalts can also engulf. If he resists consciousness, he may mistake the archetypal for the personal, the divine for the literal. He may cling to the woman as though she were the source of the experience, failing to see that she is its symbol. The danger of possession, psychological and emotional, always accompanies the activation of such depths. The conscious man, however, learns to endure the paradox. He allows the flood of feeling without seeking to own it. He stands within the current, letting it purify him of illusion. This requires humility, for the ego must admit that it is not the originator of love, but its instrument. The experience of the feminine divine teaches him reverence for all life, for he perceives that the same energy animating his passion also moves the universe. At this depth, he may dream of water, of fire, of the moon. These are images of transformation, the unconscious communicating through symbol. Water signifies immersion in the maternal principle. Fire, the consuming presence of spirit. The moon, the cyclic renewal of the soul. Each dream reflects a stage in the alchemical marriage between his consciousness and the archetypal feminine. Emotionally, he oscillates between awe and exhaustion. The magnitude of what he feels can scarcely be borne. At times he wishes to flee, to return to the safety of superficial love. Yet part of him knows that retreat would be spiritual regression. For once the divine has been glimpsed, the soul can never again be content with the merely human. The encounter with the archetypal feminine reveals to him that every act of love is also an encounter with death. To unite with the source of life is to confront impermanence, for the same power that creates also dissolves. He feels the trembling awareness that love and mortality are one, that in embracing another fully, he is also consenting to his own dissolution. This realization does not sadden him, it sanctifies him. He understands that love is the soul's way of remembering its divine origin. Every surrender, every moment of union is a rehearsal for the final surrender of the ego into the eternal. The woman's presence becomes a living sacrament, a reminder that the divine is not distant but embodied, not abstract but intimate. Psychologically, such recognition marks the beginning of spiritual maturity. The man ceases to worship the external feminine. He begins to honor the inner one. He no longer projects divinity onto the woman. He perceives it through her. This subtle shift transforms devotion into consciousness. The archetype, once externalized, now becomes an inner guiding image, the anima integrated as mediator between the ego and the self. Symbolically, this corresponds to the alchemical stage of illumination, the moment when the work reveals its hidden gold. The darkness of desire becomes translucent with spirit. The erotic, the emotional, the spiritual, all merge into a single experience of meaning. The man perceives that there is no conflict between body and soul. Both are expressions of the same divine totality. In this realization, his perception of the woman changes yet again. She is no longer seen as savior or temptress, but as companion on the path of individuation. He recognizes her as a fellow image-bearer of the divine. The love between them becomes not fusion but dialogue, a continual exchange of consciousness through which both are refined. The sensations at this stage are quieter but more enduring. He feels an inner radiance, a serenity that does not depend on circumstance. The storm of passion subsides into a luminous calm. He carries within him the awareness that every human encounter is potentially sacred, that the divine speaks through the ordinary. Spiritually, he has touched the point where eros becomes agape, where personal love expands into universal compassion. The feminine energy that once shook his foundations now steadies his heart. He sees her everywhere, in the wind that moves the trees, in the face of a stranger, in the stillness of his own breath. She has become the world's soul, made visible. What he feels inside is difficult to describe. It is a quiet exaltation, a reverent joy tinged with melancholy, for he knows that all beauty is transient. Yet this knowledge no longer wounds him. It deepens his gratitude. He understands that the purpose of love is not possession, but revelation to glimpse, however briefly, the eternal through the eyes of another. In that recognition, the man is reborn. The child who once sought the mother's comfort, the youth who chased the lover's ecstasy, the seeker who yearned for God, all find their fulfillment in this one truth, that the divine and the human are not separate. They meet in the field of the heart, in the mystery of the feminine, where creation itself whispers, "I am here." When the outer union dissolves, many imagine that love ends. Yet in the language of the psyche, nothing that has once been deeply experienced ever disappears. What the man shared with the woman continues within him, though transformed from flesh into image, from contact into meaning. She ceases to be a person of memory and becomes a living symbol of his inner life. Psychologically, this is the integration of the anima, the moment when the feminine, once projected outward onto a partner, is reclaimed as an inner reality. The man does not lose her, he internalizes her. She becomes the voice of intuition, the source of feeling, the quiet companion who mediates between his conscious mind and the depths of the self. In the beginning, he may mistake this transformation for grief. The absence of her body feels like a wound. He dreams of her, hears her name in ordinary sounds, senses her nearness in places she has never been. Yet these are not hauntings, but signs of the psyche's work. The image of the woman is being withdrawn from the external world and woven into the fabric of his soul. He begins to realize that the pain of separation is not punishment, but metamorphosis. Love that was once outward must now turn inward. The longing he feels is the movement of libido, the psychic energy that seeks new form. Through this inward redirection, what was personal becomes universal. What was desire becomes devotion. Symbolically, this corresponds to the alchemical rubedo, the reddening, the final stage of the opus in which the purified elements are united and spirit and matter become one. The fire of passion, once consuming, now illuminates. The man's heart, tempered by suffering, glows with quiet radiance. He notices that his perception of the world has changed. Simple things, the sound of rain, the curve of a leaf, the gaze of a stranger seem charged with significance. He feels her presence in everything, not as nostalgia but as participation. The feminine principle he once sought in her is now encountered everywhere, animating all of life. Psychologically, this marks the birth of symbolic consciousness. He has learned to perceive outward events as reflections of inner reality. What he once projected onto a single woman, he now sees mirrored in the world, in art, in nature, in dream. She has become the soul of his perception, the lens through which he experiences meaning. The sensations accompanying this realization are subtle but profound. There is a calm in him that was not there before, a sense of depth that no success or possession can equal. The anxiety of seeking has vanished. In its place is a gentle awareness that he already carries what he once desired. Her image lives within as a lamp that does not go out. He may still dream of her, but the dreams are no longer tormented. In them she speaks, guides, or simply appears as presence. These dreams mark the continuing dialogue between ego and self, the soul using her image as language. Each dream refines his understanding, reminding him that love's purpose was never possession but transformation. Symbolically, she is now the Sophia, the inner wisdom that mediates between heaven and earth. She speaks not in words but in intuition, in subtle guidance that steers him toward authenticity. He begins to act from a deeper center, no longer driven by ambition or fear, but by quiet fidelity to the truth he has learned through her. In his daily life, this integration manifests as gentleness, patience, and a new capacity for empathy. He listens differently, speaks differently. The defensive sharpness that once guarded his pride has been replaced by compassion. He sees that every person carries within them some fragment of the eternal feminine, the principle of relatedness, of care, of creation. Spiritually, he begins to grasp that love is not an event, but a state of consciousness. The woman who awakened him was the instrument through which this state was revealed. Her departure was necessary, for no outer relationship could contain what had become inwardly eternal. Through her, he has come to know the self, the center that unites all opposites and holds the meaning of existence. He feels both sorrow and gratitude. The sorrow arises from the ego's longing for the lost form. The gratitude flows from the soul's recognition of its gain. This dual emotion is the mark of maturity. It signifies that he can hold life's paradoxes without retreating into denial or despair. He has learned that wholeness includes both joy and pain, union and loss. Symbolically, he has completed the cycle of the coniunctio. The opposites, masculine and feminine, self and other, love and death, have been reconciled within. He walks now as one who carries the memory of unity even in separation. The world no longer appears divided. It glows with the quiet assurance of meaning fulfilled. At times he may still feel her absence as ache, but the ache has changed. It is no longer hunger, but remembrance, like the echo of sacred music that continues after the last note fades. This remembrance keeps him human. It softens his heart toward others, for he knows that every soul seeks the same lost wholeness. He understands now that every love, however brief, is a revelation of eternity. The woman who once stood before him as mystery has become the inner image of the divine. Through her, he has encountered the living God within, not a deity of dogma, but the presence of consciousness itself, the luminous center that gives form to life. From this awareness arises a profound responsibility. He must now live what he has learned. Love, having been internalized, demands expression through compassion, creativity, and truth. The anima becomes the inspirer of his work, his art, his service. Everything he touches bears her invisible signature. And so, even when he leaves, she remains. She moves through his thoughts, his dreams, his acts of kindness. She has become his muse, his conscience, his bridge to the unseen. What once was an external relationship has turned into an inner companionship that endures beyond time. In the quiet moments, when he walks alone, he may feel her presence like a breath across his soul. It is not imagination, but integration, the psyche's way of affirming that nothing of love is ever lost. Every genuine encounter becomes part of the eternal circulation of life, returning always to its source. This is how a man feels when he has truly loved and truly awakened. The loss of the outer form does not diminish him, it expands him. He discovers that through loving a woman, he has come to love the world. The boundaries of self have widened until they include all that is. Psychologically, he stands at the threshold of individuation fulfilled. The anima, once autonomous and capricious, now serves the self, the ordering principle that unites all parts of the psyche. The man lives no longer as fragment but as whole, his inner and outer lives harmonized by meaning. Symbolically, the journey has come full circle. What began as desire has ended as wisdom. What began as projection has become integration. what began as two has revealed the one. He carries within him the sacred image that first called him to love, now recognized as the divine mirror through which the soul beholds itself. And thus, even when he departs, you remain within him not as memory, but as presence. You are the voice that whispers in his intuition, the calm that steadies his will, the compassion that softens his strength. You are the inner woman through whom he continues to relate to life itself. For the man who has truly encountered the soul of a woman, there is no return to ignorance. Love has done its work. It has opened his depths, revealed his divinity, and bound him forever to the living mystery. Through you, he has seen his own eternal face, and that vision will never fade.